Imagine climbing into a stranger's car for what should be a 10-minute job and not walking free again for months. That's exactly what happened to a young woman named Josephine on a rainy November night in Philadelphia. She had no idea she'd just gotten into the car of a man the press would later call the Marshall Street Madman. Before we dive into this nightmare, if true crime stories like this keep you up at night in the best way possible, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Costs you nothing, but it tells us you want more of these deep dives. And honestly, it helps more than you'd think. Now, let's get into it. The film, The Silence of the Lambs, remains one of the defining moments of Anthony Hopkins' career, who brought the monstrous Hannibal Lecter to life. But Lecter wasn't the only killer in that story. The film's second antagonist was the grotesque Buffalo Bill, a character author Thomas Harris built by drawing from real serial killers. One of them would come to be known as the Marshall Street Madman. Before he became a murderer, this man played the role of a manipulative pastor, leading a small flock of devoted followers. It's chilling to think about, because among all the cruelest crimes imaginable against women, this man committed nearly every one of them. A man who called himself a light to his congregation was capable of hunting vulnerable women, chaining them, torturing them in the most inhuman ways possible, and ultimately killing them. And yet, his actions may not have been as horrifying as what his mind truly wanted. This man dreamed of building a family out of women locked in his basement, a delusional fantasy where he'd father children with his captives and finally become the father he always wanted to be. In this story, we'll uncover the terrible acts of a man Americans have never forgotten. But more importantly, we'll explore what shaped him into someone so horrific. On the night of November 26, 1986, a sex worker named Josephine Rivers walked the streets of North Philadelphia. She had no idea that night would change her life forever. Earlier that day, Josephine had argued with her boyfriend, Vincent Nash, and wasn't in the best headspace. She'd left his apartment to clear her head and, without much enthusiasm, decided to work a bit to make some money. She wasn't actively hunting for a client, but if someone stopped for her, she wouldn't turn them away. After all, clients were a quick way to scrape together enough cash to survive, and maybe even afford a decent Thanksgiving dinner. So a rundown motel or a quiet side street didn't bother her. All she needed was a few minutes. But that night wouldn't go the way she expected. After walking for a while, she noticed no cars were stopping. And to make things worse, it started raining. The cold drizzle had her pacing back and forth on the sidewalk until a car finally slowed and pulled up beside the curb. It was a silver and white Cadillac Coupe de Ville, driven by a bearded man. They quickly agreed on a price, and she climbed in. "What's your name?" she asked once inside. "Graham," he said. Then he mentioned he needed to make a quick stop at McDonald's. She followed him in, bought a coffee, and sat with him at the table. As she studied him, she noticed something odd about his features. His eyes were blue, the kind of blue that might strike most people as handsome. But on him, that blue seemed to drown in an unsettling emptiness. She glanced at his clothes, his watch, the little details people wear. Strange. He drove an expensive car, but everything on him was cheap. They sat in silence while he ate. After a few minutes, he stood and said they were heading to his place on North Marshall Street. When they arrived, Josephine immediately noticed the house looked even more run down than Graham himself. But in the garage sat a 1971 Rolls-Royce, a car considered high class for the era. She'd later say that despite how shabby he seemed, the man clearly had expensive taste in cars. As they crossed the garage, Graham reached the front door and pulled out an odd-looking key. Curious, she asked about it. "I cut it in half," he explained. "One piece stays in the lock. Nobody gets in without the other half." Inside, a hallway led straight to the kitchen, where one wall was oddly decorated with coins. Graham told her to keep walking, and they reached a living room with a TV, a VCR, and a tape player. He wanted to watch a movie, but Josephine, though she didn't show it, just wanted to finish and go home. Something about him was already making her deeply uneasy. After he paid her $20, she undressed, and they got into bed. When it was over, as she was getting dressed, Graham came up behind her and began choking her. "Please stop. I'll do anything," she gasped. He let go, but only to snap a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists. Then he marched her toward the kitchen, through another door, and down into the basement. The air down there hit her like ice. She was still only wearing a thin blouse, nowhere near enough to fight off the cold. "Quiet," Graham warned when she complained, "or I'll beat you with a piece of wood." That was the moment Josephine realized the man upstairs wasn't just disturbed. He might be something far worse. He left her on a filthy mattress, shackled her ankles to chains bolted to a pipe running along the ceiling. Then he sat beside her, laid his head in her lap, and fell asleep. Eventually, exhausted, she slept too. When she woke, she was alone. Thin light crept through cracks in the walls and a small window. She studied the room around her. A freezer, a washer and dryer, an old pool table. Everything about the place felt decayed. But the most terrifying thing was a shallow pit dug into the floor. Her first thought, would she fit inside it? She'd find out soon enough. Graham eventually returned with a plate, an egg sandwich, a glass of juice. Afraid it might be poisoned. She refused to eat. He didn't react. He simply took the plate back to the kitchen and returned with tools to widen and deepen the hole. As he dug, he told her he'd always wanted a big family. He said he'd gotten 4 different women pregnant before, but each one had left him. Now he had a new plan. Get at least 10 women, get them all pregnant, and finally build his family. Josephine froze, trying to process what she'd just heard. Before she could think further, he stepped toward her and demanded sex again. Left alone afterward, she managed to loosen the cuffs on the chains, not enough to slip free, but enough to reach the basement window. She screamed for help. A few neighbors heard her, but nobody did anything. The neighborhood was rough, and cries for help weren't unusual there. The problem was, Graham heard her too. He came back down and beat her with the wood. Then he shoved her into the freshly dug pit, forcing her into a near-fetal position, laid a sheet of plywood over the top, and stacked heavy items on it. Before leaving, to make sure no one would hear her, he turned on a radio and cranked a hard rock station to full volume. It didn't take long before the cramps set in. Soon after, breathing itself became a struggle. During the rare moments the music stopped for news and the time, she counted the hours, wondering if anyone would ever come for her. In total, she stayed in that hole for 27 hours, until she heard the basement door open again. But Graham wasn't alone this time. She could hear a second voice, a woman's, and the sound of a chain dragging across the floor. The plywood was lifted, and Graham pulled Josephine out of the pit. Her legs buckled the moment she tried to stand, but she managed to look around and saw a second woman, young, black, naked. Strangely, she didn't seem nearly as frightened as Josephine expected. Before leaving the basement, Graham said her name was Sandy. Josephine sensed almost immediately that the woman had some kind of intellectual disability. Still, they managed to talk. Sandy explained her real name was Sandra Lindley and that she'd known Graham for years. While talking, she mentioned his full name, Graham Whitfield. According to Sandra, they'd met at the Elwyn Institute, a facility for people with physical and mental disabilities. She said Graham was a good man who'd always taken care of her, and admitted she'd had a sexual relationship with him and with a friend of his named Tommy. But things changed recently when she got pregnant by Graham and had an abortion without telling him. When he found out, he offered her $1,000 to get pregnant again. She refused and ended up locked in the basement right alongside Josephine. As she told her story, Sandra suddenly seemed to understand exactly why she was down there, and she started crying. Josephine tried to comfort her by sharing pieces of her own hard life. Eventually, Graham interrupted, bringing down dinner, stale, crackers and water. 2 hours later, he came back and kept widening the pit while the 2 women watched. After a while, he stopped, demanded sex from both of them, and left. The next morning, he came down with a generous breakfast. As the 3 of them ate together like some twisted family, a knock came at the front door. Graham went to check and returned saying Sandra's sister and 2 cousins had come looking for her. He hadn't answered, and eventually they left. Graham clearly understood the situation had turned dangerous for him. To handle it, he forced Sandra to write a letter, one he'd send off to make her family believe she'd simply moved to New York. Sandra barely understood what she was doing. Josephine, on the other hand, understood exactly what it meant, and it terrified her. It meant they'd likely be trapped here a very long time, maybe forever. In the days that followed, Graham grew more animalistic. He came down only for sex, barely thinking about their basic needs. The women had become nothing more than objects for his sick desires. When he was gone, Josephine and Sandra huddled together for warmth, but that created a new problem for Graham. The two of them, stressed and desperate, began screaming non-stop for help. Every time he heard it, he came down and beat them both. Eventually, he started laying down rules, threatening to throw them into the pit if they disobeyed. Other times, as punishment, he'd leave them hanging for hours from the metal beam their chains were attached to. The torture only grew worse, and Graham seemed to relish every second of it. Meanwhile, Sandra's family had been searching for her, and eventually filed a missing persons report. Her mother told police she believed her daughter was being held by a man named Graham, though she didn't know his last name, only his address. The officer assigned to the case went to the house, but Graham never answered. That same week, Sandra's mother received the letter from New York. She didn't believe it was really from her daughter. She showed it to the officer, who told her Sandra had probably just run off somewhere for a fresh start. Still, the mother pushed, and the officer eventually tracked down people who knew Graham, leading him to a man named Tommy Braun, who had cognitive difficulties and had also had a relationship with Sandra. Over a casual conversation at a McDonald's, Tommy told the officer the man's last name was Whitfield. The real name was Whitfield. Close enough to send the search down the wrong path entirely. No Graham Whitfield turned up in any records. The investigation stalled, then quietly went cold, with no one imagining what was really happening on Marshall Street. At the end of December 1986, Graham drove through the streets of Philadelphia. Most people were out doing their holiday shopping. He was hunting for a new wife to complete his happy Christmas. He cruised for hours until, on Lehigh Avenue, he spotted a young black woman walking alone. She fit exactly the profile he was looking for. He slowed the car and made a suggestive comment. Irritated, she snapped back that she wasn't a sex worker. He apologized quickly, smoothly, convincingly, in that way only a man like him could manage. That shift in tone was enough to soften her guard. Graham offered her a ride as an apology, and she accepted, mentioning she needed to pick up a few things at a nearby store. He waited while she shopped. On the way back to the car, he asked if she wanted something to eat. Over food, he learned her name, Lisa Moore, 19 years old. He extended an invitation for the next day, suggesting a trip to Atlantic City. She hesitated, saying she didn't have anything nice to wear. So he took her to a store and handed her $50 to buy something. Afterward, they went to his house, where he poured wine and put on a movie. A few hours in, Lisa drifted off. The wine, combined with medication she was taking, hit her hard. When she woke, she was undressed in his bedroom, and he forced himself on her. Afterward, she asked to be taken home. As she reached for her clothes, Graham grabbed her by the throat and cuffed her wrists. He told her he wanted her to meet two friends and led her down to the basement. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just white plastic bags and a strange, damp smell. "Are there body parts in those bags?" she asked, terrified. "I'm not going to kill anyone," he assured her. Then he lifted the plywood off the floor, revealing Josephine and Sandra crouched below in terrible condition. He introduced the three women to each other, then forced Lisa to have sex with him again before heading upstairs for food. While he was gone, the three women talked. The first thing they all realized, three black women held captive by one disturbed, dangerous white man. 10 days later, Graham brought in a new addition to what he called his harem, 23-year-old Deborah Hale. Unlike the others, Deborah fought back, which brought down brutal punishment. Punishment that spilled over onto the other women too, breeding tension between them. Out of that tension came a strange hierarchy. Graham appointed one woman to be in charge, whenever he was away, responsible for reporting bad behavior. If someone stepped out of line, the one in charge was ordered to beat them. If Graham felt the punishment wasn't harsh enough, he'd beat everyone himself. Of them all, Josephine Rivers played this twisted game best, slowly becoming Graham's favorite wife. Around this time, his sexual demands grew even sicker, forcing the women to have sex with each other in front of him. Strangely, this also led him to finally let them bathe and stay clean. Even though the hygiene was purely for his own gratification, it kept them from getting sick in that filthy basement. Graham's unpredictable moods became something the women learned to dread and to hope for. On good days, meals were decent. On bad days, they might get bread and water, spoiled hot dogs, or peanut butter sandwiches. Eventually, he stopped bothering altogether and started feeding them canned dog food. At first, they refused, until he beat them into eating it. In January 1987, nearly a month after the last kidnapping, Graham brought home another woman, 18-year-old sex worker Jacqueline Ashford, found in front of a rundown hotel where she usually worked during lunch hours. That same day, he bought a huge order of Chinese, food for everyone. It was Josephine's birthday, his favorite wife, and he believed both she and Sandra were pregnant. Then, in early February, Graham came down to the basement and caught Sandra trying to shift the plywood covering the pit, where another woman lay, trapped inside. As punishment, he suspended her from the ceiling beam by a single handcuff on one wrist. The torture stretched on for days, and her physical state collapsed. She stopped eating entirely. Believing she was pregnant, Graham force-fed her anyway. Her health kept deteriorating, vomiting, fever, all while she hung there. Still, he wouldn't let her down. He kept forcing food into her mouth until she swallowed. During one of these sessions, Sandra lost consciousness, and he couldn't wake her. Furious, he yanked her arm down from the beam, letting her collapse to the floor, then kicked her limp body into the pit and sealed it shut. The other women grew frantic with worry. Graham told them she was faking it. Later, he checked her pulse and realized she was dead. He assumed she must have choked. He carried her body up the basement stairs to the kitchen. The women mourned Sandra in silence until the sound of an electric saw turned their grief into horror. They braced for the worst. It got even more sinister when they saw Graham's dog gnawing on a human bone. They hadn't seen everything, but they'd seen enough to know exactly what had happened. Graham dismembered the body. The arms and legs went in two. The freezer labeled dog food. The ribs were boiled in the oven. The head simmered in a pot on the stove. Eventually, he ground pieces of flesh in a food processor and mixed them into the dog food he fed both the women and his dogs. The rest of the remains he cooked on the stovetop. After witnessing that horror, the women's fear and disgust toward Graham Whitfield only deepened. Each day, he turned that house further into a living hell. Part 5. After Sandra's death, things grew even more grim. Inside the house on Marshall Street, a strong, foul odor began seeping into the basement, and soon it spread to the neighboring houses, prompting neighbors to call the authorities. The first officer to respond was a young rookie, Julian Cross. As he approached the house on Marshall Street, one of Graham's neighbors, Warren Hastings, stopped him. Warren explained he was worried about Graham, who'd struggled with depression, and urged the officer to break into the house and check inside. The rookie said he couldn't do that without authorization from above. Warren pressed on, insisting no one had seen Graham in days and that the smell coming from the house pointed to something dead. So Julian decided to do a basic walk around, mostly to ease his own conscience. As he neared the house, he could hear a hard rock station blasting from inside. He noticed movement through a window and crept around back, peering through a gap in the curtains. Through the kitchen window, he spotted a large pot on the stove. He assumed it held soup. The smell really was awful. He walked back to his cruiser, about to radio his supervisor, when Graham suddenly appeared at the front door. Julian approached and struck up a conversation, studying the man's face as they talked. To the young rookie, Graham looked completely normal. When asked about the smell, Graham explained his dinner had burned. Satisfied, Julian returned to his patrol without ever asking to see inside. After Sandra's death and the police visit, Graham's behavior grew even more calculated. He started pushing the women to behave well in exchange for better treatment in the basement. But his plans hit a snag when Josephine told him the other women were plotting a revolt. That sent him into a paranoid spiral over the possibility of an escape. He cuffed their hands and feet to the ceiling beam, stuffed plastic bags into their mouths as gags, and wrapped their heads in duct tape. Then he grabbed a set of screwdrivers of different sizes and tried to puncture their eardrums, hoping that if they couldn't hear him, they couldn't organize a rebellion. Strangely, Josephine was the only one spared from this. The attempt to deafen them failed. They could still hear, though with more difficulty. Later, Deborah Hale began taunting him, prompting Graham to drag her out of the basement and up into the kitchen. The other women waited anxiously, unsure what would happen, until the two returned. Deborah came back silent, visibly shaken. When they asked what happened, she stammered that Graham had shown her a pot on the stove, Sandra's head inside it. But it didn't end there. He'd also taken her to the oven, where Sandra's rib cage was roasting. He'd opened the fridge and pointed to other parts of her body wrapped in plastic, warning Deborah she'd be next if she didn't behave. That should have been enough to break her. But Deborah kept resisting, and Graham responded with even more violence. The next time she defied him, he stripped the insulation off an extension cord, plugged it in, and pressed the bare wires against her chains, watching her body convulse. As always, even though only Deborah had disobeyed, everyone but Josephine was punished for it. Over the following weeks, Lisa, Deborah, and Jacqueline grew weaker and more wounded from repeated shocks. Josephine, meanwhile, remained in relatively better shape by obeying Graham's every demand, earning her the twisted title of his faithful wife. On March 18, 1987, he put that loyalty to the ultimate test, launching his first coordinated round of torture. He drilled holes into the plywood lid and ordered Josephine to fill the pit with water. All three women were forced inside, and the plywood was sealed over the top. While they sat trapped, Graham fed a bare wire through one of the holes until it touched them. Because their chains connected them all together, the electricity spread through each woman at once. On a second pass, he ran the wire directly onto Deborah's chain. She took the full shock and collapsed. Even before being lowered into the pit, she'd already looked exhausted, her body clearly failing. There was no doubt. Deborah was already close to death. After that final shock, she didn't survive. Realizing what happened, Graham dragged her body out of the pit, went upstairs, made himself some sandwiches, then came back down with paper and a pen and handed them to Josephine. Write down the date and time of death, he told her. Then he made her write a full statement describing how she'd helped him kill Deborah Hale. Insurance, he said, in case she ever went to the police. By this point, it was obvious. He wanted her as his partner in future crimes. That intention became even clearer when he let her go upstairs and change clothes. Josephine was free of the basement now, though still entirely at his mercy inside the house. Deborah's body stayed in the basement the rest of that day. Only the next morning did Graham go down to wrap it and move it to the freezer. Part 6. As the days passed, Graham and Josephine went out together. Restaurants, walks around the city, even shopping trips. During one of these outings, he told her that if he were ever arrested, he'd fake insanity. He claimed he knew exactly how to fool the specialists and manipulate their evaluations. Josephine would later testify that he'd bragged about lying to the courts for years to collect disability payments for a mental illness he didn't actually have. Noticeably, the more time he spent with Josephine, the more he seemed to soften, even bringing mattresses, blankets, and pillows down for the other women. At one point, he even set up a television. Josephine, though, was forced to share his bed. Still, in her own way, she used her position to try to help the others however she could. On March 21, 1987, the two of them drove out to rural New Jersey. Along the way, Graham stopped the car and said it looked like a good spot to dump Deborah's body. The following night, he loaded her frozen remains into a Dodge van he owned and drove out there. While Josephine waited in the van, He disposed of the body in a wooded area. When he came back, he told her he wanted to find a replacement for Deborah, and this time, he wanted Josephine's help doing it. So they drove around the city until they spotted a black sex worker on a street corner. The first one who caught Graham's eye was 24-year-old Agnes Chambers, someone he already knew from past business. Josephine recognized her too. They'd once worked together at the same strip club. After agreeing on a price, Agnes climbed into the van, and the three of them drove back to the house. Like the others before her, Agnes ended up locked in the basement. But unknown to Graham, Josephine had been quietly plotting an escape from the very beginning. Having earned his trust by helping bring Agnes home, she asked if she could visit her family, promising to return, with a new wife for him on the way back. Graham, convinced she was fully on his side, agreed. On March 24th, he let her go, arranging to pick her up at midnight at a gas station near the house. At dusk, Graham dropped her off near the house and drove away. The moment she watched his car disappear down the street, Josephine ran straight to the apartment of Vincent Nash, the boyfriend she'd argued with the night she was taken. When he opened the door, he was stunned to see her standing there, gaunt and clearly shaken. She told him everything, every detail of what she'd endured at Graham Whitfield's hands. At first, Vincent struggled to believe the horror of it. The torture, the murders, the dismemberment, a dog gnawing on human remains. At one point, he almost thought she meant something else entirely, and even wanted to go confront Graham himself. But Josephine insisted they needed the police. Otherwise, the women still trapped in that basement could be killed. Vincent agreed, and the two of them found a payphone and called the authorities. Minutes later, officers John Kane and David Sanders arrived, and also had trouble believing her story, until she rolled up her pant leg and showed them the deep scars the chains had carved into her ankles. That was when it clicked. They believed her and told her to head back to the gas station as planned. When Graham's car pulled in, the two officers moved in immediately and placed him under arrest. He responded with a joke, asking if they were there about his overdue child support. They told him this was something far more serious, kidnapping and murder. At that moment, the case against Graham Whitfield was finally closing in. Part 7. After Graham's arrest, Homicide Lieutenant James Harmon and his squad arrived at the house on North Marshall Street. James tried the front door, but found it reinforced with the modified lock system Graham had built. He called for a crowbar and forced it open. Meanwhile, officers John Kane and David Sanders, following Josephine's directions, headed straight for the basement. Inside, they found Jacqueline Ashford and Lisa Moore asleep. As they approached, the women startled awake screaming until the officers identified themselves as police. When asked where the others were, the women pointed toward the wooden panel covering the pit in the floor. Before lifting it, John and David had to clear away plastic bags of dirt stacked on top. Underneath, they found Agnes Chambers, exhausted and still chained. Within minutes, all three women were pulled from the house and rushed to a waiting ambulance. As the rescue unfolded, the rest of the house was being searched. In the kitchen, officers found an aluminum pot on the stove with something greasy and yellow oozing out of it. Inside the oven sat a roasting pan with a charred piece of human rib. The refrigerator held even more human remains. In the days that followed, the house was sealed off while reporters scrambled to piece together what had happened inside. Forensic teams combed every inch of the property, the yard, old cabinets, and found stacks of pornographic magazines featuring black women. At first glance, the house looked like it belonged to a broke, decaying man. But investigators soon discovered Graham was actually wealthy, sitting on $550,000 in a stock market account. Once the media caught wind of the crimes and the man behind them, they quickly gave him a nickname, the Marshall Street Madman. Oh, name he'd later acknowledge himself during his interrogation when he opened up about his life. That's the story we're about to dig into now. Graham Michael Whitfield was born in mid-November 1943 in Eastlake near Cleveland, Ohio. He was the older of two brothers, with a younger sibling named Terry. Shortly after their births, their parents, Michael and Ellen Whitfield, divorced, and the boys went to live with their mother. Sometime later, Ellen introduced the boys to her boyfriend, a thought relationship that had actually started before the divorce. Not long after, once Graham reached middle school, he and Terry chose to move in with their father and stepmother instead. That household was full of conflict, largely because of how the boys behaved, especially Graham, who was punished psychologically for wetting the bed. Supposedly, his father would hang his soiled bedsheet out the second-floor window for the whole neighborhood to see, as a form of humiliation. At school, Graham fell out of a tree, leaving a visible deformity on his head that other kids mercilessly mocked. Notably, his behavior grew more disturbed after that accident. As he approached adolescence, he developed fixations, making money, joining the military. The obsession ran so deep that his father eventually enrolled him in Staunton Military Academy in Virginia to support it. For 2 years, Graham thrived there, earning strong grades, but at some point, his performance dropped, and he decided to return home. He later mentioned there was a day he visited the academy's psychologist, and it was after that session he decided to leave, though he never revealed what was actually discussed. Back home, Graham tried returning to regular school, but eventually gave that up too. He seemed genuinely lost about his future, so much so that at 18, he went back to military life, enlisting in the U.S. Army, where he initially showed more promise. He applied for several positions, including military police, but didn't qualify. The one spot he landed was in San Antonio, Texas, training as a medic. There he began neglecting his military duties to focus on a side business, lending money to fellow soldiers at steep interest rates, quietly accumulating a good amount of cash. That came to an end when he was transferred to West Germany to work at a military hospital. In August 1962, while his military career still looked promising, Graham was hit with dizziness, nausea, and blurred vision. The neurologist on duty diagnosed him with gastroenteritis, but it soon escalated into something the doctors recognized as signs of mental illness. They never specified a diagnosis, but later investigations strongly suggested doctors suspected schizophrenia. The evidence: the powerful medication they prescribed him, trifluoperazine, typically used to treat hallucinations. 3 months later, Graham received an honorable medical discharge from the Army and began collecting a disability pension. After leaving military life, he moved to Philadelphia. Part 8. Even though his military career ended unexpectedly, Graham kept studying, eventually qualifying as a practical nurse and enrolling at the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned credits in anthropology, history, chemistry, and biology. He also landed a job at the university hospital, but got fired for poor performance. After that, he enrolled at the Veterans Hospital, where he trained as a psychiatric nurse. He was fired from that job too, this time because of his difficult personality. Around that same period, he became involved with a married black woman, and they had a child together. But she eventually left him and went back to her husband. He then got involved with a woman named Doris, nearly 12 years older than him. At some point, one of Doris's friends noticed a wound on her leg that looked like a gunshot injury. According to Doris, Graham had accidentally shot her while handling a gun. Not long after, she fled and never contacted him again. Police would later find her alive, but in a badly unstable mental state. After these relationships, Graham kept cycling through psychiatric institutions. Then, in 1970, his mother took her own life by swallowing mercuric chloride. At the time, Ellen had already been diagnosed with bone cancer and was struggling with alcoholism. Her death pushed Graham to attempt suicide himself. He was repeatedly sent to psychiatric hospitals for observation, beginning a revolving door pattern of institutionalization. During these stays, he displayed strange behavior, going silent for long stretches. In his more lucid moments, mental tests showed his intelligence scored well above average. Around this time, during one of his stints outside an institution, Graham got into a fight with his brother Terry and struck him with a piece of wood. Days later, he visited Terry in the hospital and calmly told him that if he died, Graham would have dissolved his body in a bathtub of acid to destroy the evidence. That comment haunted Terry for the rest of his life. After that incident, Graham became increasingly withdrawn, developing strange habits, refusing to speak, wearing the same leather jacket at all times, and refusing to take it off. His hygiene deteriorated during this stretch, giving him an increasingly wild, unkempt appearance. He also developed odd mannerisms, like rolling up his pant leg so nothing would touch it. Eventually, though, he was released from the institution. In 1971, he took a trip to California, where he claimed to have received a divine revelation telling him to start his own church. Back in Philadelphia, he founded the United Church of the Ministers of God and began calling himself Bishop Whitfield. Within a few months, the church had grown to 5 members, including his brother Terry and Sandra Lindley. For 4 years, the church carried on with its small congregation, and Graham opened an investment account in the Ma'aibis church's name. Over the following years, he turned an initial $1,500 investment into roughly $545,000. During this period, he made countless visits to psychiatric institutions, often walking away with new church members, recruiting patients with mild to moderate mental struggles to attend his services. In 1976, Graham was charged with aggravated assault and unlawful possession of a firearm after shooting a man who had rented a house from him. Strangely, to carry out the attack, he broke into the house and ambushed the man, grazing his face with a bullet. The house was later sold, and the new owners reported finding pornographic magazines in the basement, along with a small hole dug into the concrete floor. The next woman Graham became involved with was Angela Davison, a black woman with an intellectual disability. Over a year later, police were called after her family reported her sister Alberta, also cognitively impaired, missing. According to them, Graham was responsible. Witnesses had seen him taking Alberta from a psychiatric facility. The search stretched on until she was finally found held captive in Graham's basement. Alberta was taken to the hospital, where doctors found she'd been sexually assaulted, sodomized, and had contracted gonorrhea. Graham was arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, and interference with the custody of a committed person. In November 1978, he stood trial, pleading not guilty. Mental health experts described him as manipulative and sexually immature. The jury found him guilty, sentencing him to 3 to 7 years in prison. Through appeals, he ended up serving 3 years across several psychiatric institutions. In April 1983, he was released under a state mental health supervision program, one that failed to grasp just how dangerous he really was. Part 9. After Graham's release, Angela simply vanished. Police investigated, but never found any trace of her. Some believe Graham was responsible for his ex-girlfriend's disappearance. Strangely, after his time in prison, he turned his attention to Asian women, and that's how he met a young Filipino woman named Betty Santos. Betty had the misfortune of flipping through a pen pal catalog when she came across Graham's listing. American man, 36 years old, nurse, single. For 2 years, they only exchanged letters until in September 1985, Betty flew to Philadelphia. When she arrived, she realized he looked far older than his photos suggested. After leaving the airport, he brought her back to the house on North Marshall Street, where she was surprised to find a black woman already living there. Graham explained the woman was simply a tenant. Still uneasy, Betty stayed on, and by October 1985, the two were married. For the first few months, Graham treated her decently. Then one day she came home to find him in bed with 3 black women. Furious and humiliated, she demanded he pay for a plane ticket back to the Philippines. He refused. From then on, Betty lived almost like a servant in her own home, forced to watch him with other women and often beaten for no reason at all. It came to a head in 1986 when he assaulted her brutally. She fled and never spoke to him again. But she did go to the police and report the abuse. 2 weeks after she disappeared, Graham was arrested and charged with indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. Betty, however, never showed up for the preliminary hearing. Not long after, Graham kidnapped Josephine Rivers, and over the following 4 months, captured the rest of the women who would end up in that basement. But before his arrest for the basement crimes, in 1987, Betty resurfaced, taking him to court to demand financial support. The judge noted that, according to the records, Graham had substantial wealth, something Graham denied while putting on an act of insanity in the courtroom. Series of psychological evaluations were ordered, largely due to his long history in and out of psychiatric institutions. At that point in his life, no one could have imagined that Graham Whitfield had already caused the deaths of 2 women and was holding 4 more captive. That fact would stun the nation soon after, when his face hit the news, accused of kidnapping 6 women and murdering 2 of them. One of Philadelphia's worst criminals was about to be exposed, first to America and soon to the entire world. Graham Whitfield's first appearance before the law came on April 23, 1987, alongside his attorney, Charles Preston. With the wealth he had access to, Graham hired Charles, a lawyer known for his skill in the courtroom, who at the time was working out of West Philadelphia and had recently defended a man in a murder case. For agreeing to represent the Marshall Street Madman, Graham promised him roughly $100,000. Before the court, the prosecution laid out the case, charging Graham with murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated assault, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, indecent exposure, false imprisonment, unlawful restraint, simple assault, indecent assault, and a long list of related charges. The prosecution's central strategy was using the surviving victims themselves as key witnesses. The first to testify was Lisa Moore, who detailed every act she'd endured at Graham's hands, including the murders of Sandra Lindley and Deborah Hale. The second witness for the prosecution was Josephine Rivers, who appeared before the court composed and unshaken. To anyone watching, it looked as though she'd rehearsed this moment for a long time. She held nothing back, describing the murders of Sandra and Deborah in graphic detail, including her own forced role in the torture that led to Deborah's death. Later, defense attorney Charles Preston tried to argue that Josephine had actually encouraged some of Graham's crimes. That theory gained some traction when he cross-examined Lisa Moore, who admitted Josephine did seem, at times, like a willing partner. But before that narrative could take hold, Jacqueline Ashford's testimony shifted everything. She confirmed Josephine had only gone along with things under direct threat of death and torture. After the key witnesses, the prosecution called County Medical Examiner Paul Ostrander, who described everything found in Graham's kitchen. He said it took 11 days just to catalog it all. In summary, 2 forearms, 1 arm, 2 knees, and 2 sections of human thigh, all showing signs of saw cuts, along with blood-stained clothing, multiple saws, used cotton, mayonnaise jars, a used moldy condom, and other items. In total, Graham had kept about 9 of human flesh in his refrigerator, wrapped and stored as if it were ordinary food. The formal trial was set for June 20th, 1988, where the prosecution would once again lay out every gruesome detail before a final verdict. In the meantime, all of Graham's assets were frozen by the government, much to the frustration of Charles Preston, who watched his expected payday evaporate. The defense, led by Charles, built its case around an insanity plea. Over 2 full days, the jury heard testimony from victims, families, police officers, and medical experts. The defense brought in a psychiatrist and a psychologist, trying to prove Graham hadn't been mentally sound during the crimes. But the strategy stumbled when Charles Preston again suggested Josephine had been Graham's accomplice. The judge shut that down immediately, pointing out that if Graham had been capable of recruiting an accomplice, that alone proved he understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't insane. The comment left the defense with nothing to stand on. Charles tried to call yet another mental health expert, but the court ruled that his continued attempts to push a mental illness narrative were only confusing the jury. The entire insanity defense was thrown out as inadmissible. On June 30th, 1988, the jury found Graham Whitfield guilty on every single charge. The next day, he was sentenced to death for the murders of Deborah Hale and Sandra Lindley. When the verdict was read, Graham sat perfectly still, showing no reaction, the same blank indifference he displayed throughout the entire trial. He was sent to the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he later attempted suicide and failed. For the years that followed, he lived out his sentence largely in silence, simply waiting for the day of his execution. Guards said he spent hours reading the Bible or staring blankly at the wall of his cell. He barely fought his sentence through the courts, not until nearly a decade later, when his daughter, Maxine Davison White, and his ex-wife, Betty Santos, filed a federal appeal together, arguing he wasn't mentally fit to be executed. After a lengthy legal battle, the district court ruled 2 years later that the execution would proceed as planned. Graham Whitfield was executed on July 6, 1999. His final meal was 2 slices of cheese pizza and black coffee. Around 10:30 that night, he died by lethal injection. No family member ever came forward to claim his body. Lisa Moore, Jacqueline Ashford, and Agnes Chambers became fairly prominent in the media during the years leading up to his execution, as all 3 struggled deeply to rebuild anything resembling a normal life, especially due to the lasting hearing damage from Graham's attempts to puncture their eardrums with screwdrivers. Josephine Rivers didn't share that particular struggle, but she appeared alongside the others on various television programs over the years. The victims also pursued civil lawsuits to claim a share of Graham's frozen assets as compensation for what they'd endured, a matter that was ultimately settled privately, out of the public eye. One strange final detail. During his trial, Graham seemed genuinely disappointed to learn that none of his victims had actually been pregnant. He even complained, saying he'd done all of that for nothing, a comment that, more than anything else, revealed just how deep his sickness ran and how completely lost he'd become inside his own twisted fantasy.